Good morning. It's Friday, October 24th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 749 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FTD Morning Brief. It was only a matter of time. We knew this would likely be the case. Apparently, somewhere between, let's say, 7 and 10 out of the 13 slain hostages still in Gaza are able to be located. This is what Israeli officials are saying right now, one apparently saying so to Vice President J.D. Vance. I know there's going to be serious disappointment and sadness about this in Israel, but I have to admit, I never thought Israel would get this many hostages back. I'm not saying that the Israelis should feel fortunate. That's not the word I would use after these past 2 years, but I do think that Trump and Bibi were able to squeeze more out of Hamas than anyone thought ever possible, and all things considered, that's probably a good thing. Our guest today is Eitan Fischberger, a Qatar specialist who, like me, has a bee in his bonnet when it comes to this terror-sponsoring microstate. Doha is positioning itself as an instrumental piece of the Gaza reconstruction puzzle. And that, folks, is where I draw the line. Eitan and I will discuss Qatar's strategy, what it wants out of Gaza, and what it wants from the region. Maybe what does it want from the world? So stay tuned for that. We'll have that conversation in about as much time as it takes to travel across the state of Qatar by plane. And yes, I'm talking about roughly 6 minutes. I had a fascinating conversation with two Israelis if Hamas doesn't surrender and it retains the slice of Gaza that it currently controls. Historically, ceasefire lines become permanent in the Middle East. The blue line in the north after the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000. The green line in and around the West Bank after 1948. The purple line with Syria after 1967. None of them have changed. Now consider this. If Hamas remains defiant, should Israel retain military control in the areas beyond the yellow line? If that happened, Israel would suddenly be sitting on roughly 53% of Gaza. This arrangement would grant Israel a large buffer zone separating Hamas rockets from Israeli population centers. It might also give Gazans a choice. They could live under Hamas rule on one side of the yellow line or have the chance of a better life on the other. I know which one I would choose. Here's my question. Who the hell would want to remain in Hamas borders would be sealed up tight with only food and medicine getting in, like what we see now? Whatever happens next in the Hamas-controlled areas, I expect to see more howls from Hollywood and college campuses. The false charges of war crimes will resume. But if Hamas doesn't surrender and it clings to a smaller piece of real estate on the Med with the single focus of destroying Israel, what? Headline 1, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan wrapped up his tour of the Gulf with a trip to Oman. Yesterday, the Sultan of Turkey met with the Sultan of Oman, Haytham bin Tariq Al Said. It was a closed-door meeting with no follow-up press conference. Erdogan's communications office published a statement noting that the two leaders discussed bilateral relations, and the issue of Gaza. Predictable. The Turks and the Omanis signed over a dozen bilateral agreements and committed to working together towards a but let's get real for a minute, shall we? Turkey is a state sponsor of Hamas. Oman is a state sponsor of the Houthis. And now the two countries are joining hands in a quest for the two-state solution. Shut the front door. A reminder here that neither country should be welcomed as U.S. allies so long as they harbor terrorist groups in the Middle East. Headline 2, the warring Hamas and Fatah factions convened for discussions in Egypt yesterday to talk, wait for it, unity. Just a reminder here that these two Palestinian factions cannot agree on the color of hummus. Hamas seized control of Gaza back in 2000, that including shooting Fatah guys in the kneecaps and throwing them off of tall buildings. And yes, if you want to learn more about this war, you can buy a book on Amazon.com called Hamas versus Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine by a loudmouth Philadelphian named Jonathan Schanzer. Now, for their purported attempts to reconcile, this is the umpteenth time they've tried to bury the hatchet since 2007. I've literally lost track of how many times they've tried to do this. This time, it's a little different, primarily because, well, Fatah is a lot stronger after Hamas took a Syria's beating for Israel over the last 2 years, Fatah sees an opportunity to assert itself in post-war Gaza. Admittedly, sorting out Gaza's government is a key part of Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza, except the last time I checked, Hamas is not supposed to be involved in the post-war Gaza plan. Come on, Mr. President. Hold the line. And headline 3, back to Turkey, where the country has renewed military deployment mandates for Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. The United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, otherwise known as UNIFIL, otherwise known as a huge waste of money and space. That means 2 more years of Turkish troops serving in the so-called peacekeeping force. Turkey's stated goal here is to continue providing assistance to the Lebanese armed forces, also known as the LAF. That sounds about as good for Lebanon as an outbreak of the Ebola virus. Hezbollah has been getting assistance from Turkey in recent months. No thanks. Seriously, hard pass. 1 star. Would not recommend. And now for Syria and Iraq, Ankara extended the deployment mandates for both countries by 3 years. It's all about keeping down the Kurds. But let's just be clear, between all these deployments and Turkey's meddling in Gaza, I don't like what's happening here. It looks like the Turks are trying to assert themselves just as the Iranians are starting to back away all over the region. I don't like this at all. Neo-Ottomanism, not for me, not for the region. Let's push back. All right, it's now time for that discussion with Middle East analyst Eitan Fischberger. He's a repeat offender. So without further ado, let's welcome him onto the show. Welcome to the program, Eitan Fischberger.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you back. Thanks for agreeing to endure more abuse. Let's talk about the role of Qatar in post-war Gaza. Does it have a role? I mean, I guess the real question is they don't have a military, right? They don't really have forces to deploy. There's nothing tangible that they offer other than money and influence. So is that really what we're talking about here?
As far as I can tell, that's exactly what we're talking about. But the thing that makes Qatar so dangerous to Gaza, to Palestinians, to Israel, to the U.S., and to the West more broadly, is that they know how to wield that money and influence in such a way that their agenda is promoted and the agenda of everyone else is demoted. So, they didn't need vast amounts of military and armed forces to help prop up Hamas all these years, right? They did it with their money and influence. And that's exactly what they'll continue to do, just on a different front. So, in Qatar, I think the evidence shows that they want to have as much of a foothold there as possible in order to ensure that, in my opinion, Hamas continues to thrive, whether it's explicitly or in some technocratic. Just yesterday, the Qatar charity pledged another $16 million to Gaza to prop up 8 organizations there, quote unquote, and to bring in bulldozers and building materials and this and that, and it's the same MO as it always is.
I have a theory. Tell me what you think about this. You remember that group called the Nusra Front? The Qataris came in and said, "You're no longer a while." And you had this new Al-Qaeda group that was no longer an Al-Qaeda group. And then suddenly HTS swings through all of Syria. They're now in control. And the guy that was once an Al-Qaeda leader is now rebranded as the legitimate leader of Syria. Is that what we think is going to happen in Gaza? Do you think that the Qataris are trying to rebrand Hamas? We'll call them something else like the Islamic Reform Movement or some other, bull fertilizer like that. And then all of a sudden you've got Hamas with a new, a new mask on, a new hat, if you will, a new name, and they take over Gaza in name only.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they're going to try to do. And I think that this sort of unity framework that they're going to try to figure out with the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, PFLP, Islamic Jihad, you name it, all these to just make sure that whatever technocratic government is in place, that Hamas is an integral part of it, for sure.
Amazing what money can buy these days. All right, let's back up for a minute. I want to scare the poop out of the Qataris and effectively push them to try to sue for peace or a ceasefire.
So I would argue yes, and I got actually into a bit of a tit for tat with Zach Witkoff, Steve Witkoff's son earlier this week on Twitter/X is what brought the deal to fruition. Because as you know, Witkoff has been in this role since February of 2025, and nothing happened. All of a sudden, there was the strike in Doha. 5 Hamas leaders were killed. Qatar's, aura of impenetrability as a safe haven for terrorists was threatened. And 7 days after the strike, the deal was announced. So we got into this back and forth. He obviously took the side of his father. He seems like a very good son. I took the opposing side. But what I found interesting was that President Donald Trump, that the strike in Qatar is what did it. If you'll permit me to read the quote, I'm not going to do the Trump accent, but he basically says, quote, "And when he made that one tactical mistake, him meaning Netanyahu, the one on Qatar, and that was terrible, but actually, and I actually told the Emir, this is one of the things that brought all of us together because it was so out of joint." Me is Trump saying, yeah, the strike is what did it. Absolutely.
Next time I want you to do it in Trump's voice. Okay. Yeah, well, we should try anyway. Lacking Qatari influence here in the United States for a long time. So maybe just tell us, what's the latest outrage we should be aware of, and why do you find their money in America so concerning? I know I don't like it either, but I think it'd be helpful.
Sure. So Qatar's agenda broadly is one that is akin to the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda, which is the destabilization being the United States. And so everything they do eventually leads to that conclusion, that outcome, they hope. And I think that you see this just an anecdotal example. I was reading a report last night that recently came out from the Middle East Forum about Qatari influence in Northwestern University. And they talked about how there are professors on these campuses that are shipped over from Doha to American campuses. And these professors have met with Sinwar, have met with PFLP terrorists, and they're just promoting this radical agenda in the U.S. in these camps. So that's why I think it's obviously bad. But in terms of just how far they've penetrated into the United States, I was looking a few weeks ago into there's been a lot of talk of the FARA Act recently, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and everyone's accusing always Israel, as they always do, of controlling the U.S. government and Congress and AIPAC and all that, all the usual narratives. And I looked into Qatar's foreign agents, and it turned out that they have 31 foreign agents, which is double the amount that Israel has. Israel has 16. And Qatar, 22 of those 31 are based in D.C. and the surrounding area, which is in the D.C. area out of all of them, which to me is insane. Since 2016, Qatar has spent $250 million on 88 lobbying and PR firms and logging 627 in-person political meetings in the last 4 years alone, far outpacing any other countries. So these guys are their influence is all encompassing.
I think we got to just mention here, this is a country of 330,000 citizens, and they're doing all of this FARA activity, all of this money. What in the wide world of sports does a country of 330,000 and all of this money being spent? They obviously have a much deeper agenda, and I think it's disgusting. I mean, there's no limit for how much money you can spend in Washington, how many registered agents you have, and it doesn't matter how small you are, but I think it should be pretty telling that when you've got this tiny micro state with people who don't care, by and large, about what's happening outside their borders, and you've got this hyperactive government, I think we should all be concerned. What about this between the Taliban and Pakistan? What do you make of all that?
That's just more typical Qatar MO. They've played the role of arsonist and firefighter for decades at this point. They prop up a terror group. They make the terror group a threat to the West and to the neighboring countries. And then once the terror group gets to a point where it becomes a genuine threat to everyone else, then Qatar likes to swoop in and play firefighter and say, "Oh no, we're gonna do it here as well." That's exactly what they're doing. What they did and continue to try to do with Hamas and Israel. This is just the standard MO. They've long played arsonist and firefighter, and I think that in the U.S. and in Europe and in Israel, for sure, we've been far too hesitant to call them out for that.
Yeah, and I got to say, I mean, we all remember that the Qataris hosted a Taliban, the terms under which the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan and left the Taliban.
And that went off.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what a disaster that was, right? And so here they are swooping in again. And it's kind of interesting because the Pakistanis were at one point patrons of the Taliban, as were the Qataris in alliance. Let me make sure that this thing ends on better terms for the Taliban, this Islamist state that we are advocating for. And you always get the sense that when they negotiate, they're negotiating in ways that benefit their Islamist jihadist clients, as they're doing in Gaza right now.
If you'll permit me, also during the negotiations, there's the Al Sharq newspaper, which is one of Qatar's state-owned outlets, and the editor-in-chief, when the negotiations really kicked into high gear, the editor-in-chief, a gentleman named Jaber Al-Harmi, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, he tweeted a picture of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the October 7th massacre, holding a pistol in his hand with the caption, "And now we start the negotiations." So this, to me, I mean, they're not hiding the ball. When you look close enough, they're not hiding their agenda.
No, they're not. Yeah. All right. Talk to us about Qatari influence in Europe. There seems to be a lot of it. What does it mean in the end for us? I mean, why does it matter that the Qataris are throwing their weight around across the Atlantic?
I think it matters because, the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Qatar, right? Qatar is part and parcel of the Brotherhood. They are deeply entrenched in that movement. It's to destabilize the West. And so they start with Israel, then they move over to Europe, and before you know it, they cross the Atlantic as well. And I think that, when you slowly fray Western civilization, you can kick the can down the road. You can say, no, it's fine. So they're bribing politicians en masse in Qatar, in Europe, in the EU. It's not a big deal for us. But then you remember that it happens here too. They if I'm not mistaken, former Senator Bob Menendez was convicted for accepting Qatari and Egyptian bribes. They tried to have a spy operation targeting Senator Ted Cruz. So it starts over there in Europe, but it's a promo for what they're trying to do in the United States as well. I think that people definitely need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and Qatar Gate, this was the Qataris trying to buy off European parliamentarians to whitewash their bribing of officials to get the World Cup a couple of years back. And while they were hosting the World Cup, there were massive human rights violations, and they were asking these European parliamentarians to whitewash that as well. And now, according to something that I just read the other day, sort of this small European publication, there's a movement by some of these parliamentarians to just make the whole thing go away, as if Qatar was never there in the first place. It's truly remarkable, this influence operation that apparently is powered by Qatari cash. All right, last question before I let you go. Big picture. What does Qatar think it's going to achieve long term? I mean, what is their big picture strategy when you broaden all of this out? What is this tiny state, this little zit on the back of Saudi Arabia? What do they think they're doing around the world?
So I think obviously we mentioned before that their ultimate goal, in my opinion, is to supplant Western civilization with their Islamist Muslim Brotherhood agenda, with their civilization. But I think that the way that they're doing it now is they have the strategy of hedging, right? So they'll bet on both sides of every issue so that no matter who wins in the end, Qatar will be positioned well enough to promote its agenda. So with the Trump administration, I think that they've been trying to do the same. I think that they're trying very hard, and I think unfortunately very successfully, to embed itself with embed might not be the right word, but to sort of ingratiate itself with the people in power, with the agencies in power, and they're just trying to make inroads and to just show that Qatar is the peacemaker, Qatar is the best, Qatar is great for the U.S. economy. Who cares if the United States pledges pretty much Article 5 NATO guarantees to Qatar that if Qatar is ever attacked, the U.S. will send troops there? Who cares if there's a Qatari Air Force facility in Idaho? It's all good because we're just allies of the U.S. Meanwhile, behind the scenes and in Arabic and their Arabic local outlets, they are more than willing to divulge their actual agenda, which is very anti-American. So I think that right now their agenda is just to continue to promote this strong relationship that they have with the U.S., even though it's completely built on a nefarious agenda and lies.
Unbelievable. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Eitan Fischberger, for joining us today on the
Thank you for having me.
All right, here's what we have on tap for you today here at FDD. FDD's newest analyst, Keti Korkia, is out with a policy brief examining Georgia's Democratic backslide. That's Georgia, the country, not the Peachtree State. The country's ruling Georgian Dream Party, which is cozy with Russia, China, and Iran, recently passed legislation expanding its own ability to repress Georgia's pro-Western opposition. Georgian Dream's billionaire founder doesn't hold office, but he apparently runs the damn place. Keti's advice is to impose targeted sanctions on individuals and entities affiliated with that Georgian Dream Party. In a new research memo, FDD's Ivana Stradner and Emily Hesker expose how Russia and China weaponize the United Nations to export oppression. Last year, the UN adopted a cybercrime treaty that effectively allows authoritarian regimes to recruit democracies to assist with trumped-up criminal prosecutions. Ivana and Emily explain how the U.S. can confront the rise of digital authoritarianism. And finally, check out my colleague Natalie Icano's policy brief about Doha's latest screed. Days after pressuring Hamas to accept Trump's plan for Gaza, Qatar's emir delivered a speech at their so-called parliament, blaming Israel for violating the ceasefire. Remarkably, the dictator of this tiny microstate didn't mention Hamas or the October 7th massacre. You all know how I feel about this slimy regime, so I'll just say this. Qatar has spent years propping up Hamas, and now it wants to get involved in the post-war Gaza action. Natalie and I both agree that is a supremely poor idea. And with that, show's over, folks. Go home or go to work or press rewind and listen to this whole thing again. As you weigh these important life choices, just remember to check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, and across our socials. And yes, folks, you still can make that generous tax-deductible donation in the year 2025 at fdd.org/invest. Be generous. Why not? Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, enjoy your weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.